When she began to become incoherent, we stopped. That is the surgeon. Those are his own words, decades later, describing the operation. So picture the room he was describing. A young woman, 23 years old, is lying on a table and she is awake. There is only a local anesthetic. They have already drilled 2 holes into the front of her skull. One doctor leans in with an instrument he later compared to a butter knife, and he begins to cut into the living brain of a conscious woman. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. The other doctor is talking to her the whole time. He asks her to recite the Lord's Prayer. He asks her to sing God Bless America. He asks her to count backward, not to comfort her. He is using her voice as a gauge. As long as she can still speak, still pray, still count, they keep cutting. When her words started to slur, when the sentences fell apart, that was the signal. That was how they knew how deep to go. When she began to become incoherent, we stopped. Sit with that. They were carving away her mind in real time, and they measured their progress by listening to it disappear. Now, the part nobody expects, that young woman was a Kennedy, and her own family put her on that table. You know the brothers, John, the president, Bobby, Teddy. You know the glamour, the compound, the cameras, the sense that this one family was built to be looked at. But there were 9 Kennedy children, and the eldest daughter, the one they put on that table, has been almost completely erased from the story. Her name was Rosemary. She was born in 1918 in Brookline, Massachusetts, right in the middle of a flu pandemic, and she was, by every account, a real young woman with a real inner life. She kept diaries, she wrote about operas, about tea dances, about getting fitted for dresses, about a visit to the White House. In 1938, when her father was the American ambassador to Britain, Rosemary was presented at the royal court as a debutante, curtsying before the King and Queen of England. Think about that image. A Kennedy daughter in a gown, bowing to a queen. She also had an intellectual disability. She read and wrote and counted at about a 4th grade level. What caused it was never medically confirmed. According to the definitive biography of her life, something may have gone wrong on the day she was born, when a delayed delivery may have starved her brain of oxygen. That is the leading theory. No medical record ever proved it. What is certain is this: she was gentle, she was social, she was loved, and she was slower than her siblings in a family that did not tolerate slow. And in a family obsessed with being the best, that difference stopped looking like a daughter to love. It started looking like a problem to solve. Here's the part that should bother you. The problem was never really Rosemary. The problem was the image. Joseph Kennedy Sr. wasn't just a rich father. He was building a dynasty on purpose, grooming his sons for the White House, and he ran the family like a brand that could never be embarrassed. For years, she fit the brand. Then, in her early 20s, she changed. She grew irritable and frustrated. She had convulsions. She had violent rages, and she started to lash out, hitting the people around her. Her father placed her in a convent school in Washington, run by nuns, hoping the walls would hold the problem. They didn't. The nuns reported that Rosemary was sneaking out at night, sometimes for hours, and coming back in the early morning. And you have to understand what that meant to a man like Joe Kennedy. It wasn't a father worried about his daughter's safety. Not first. What terrified him was scandal. A young woman slipping out alone at night in the 1940s. In his head, he saw an assault, a pregnancy, a whispered story that could reach a newspaper and stain the family name just as his sons were rising. To Joe, Rosemary had stopped being a daughter to protect. She had become a live threat to the one thing he cared about most. And around that same time, he heard about a brand new operation that promised to make difficult people calm, permanently. The operation was called a lobotomy, and in 1941 it was still an experiment. The 2 doctors, Walter Freeman and James Watts, had performed the first prefrontal lobotomy in the United States only 5 years earlier. The procedure was still rejected by the American Medical Association. It was not accepted, it was not proven, and there was no real evidence it made anyone better. What it reliably did was blunt people, flatten them, and to Joe, apparently, that was enough. So in November of 1941, Joseph Kennedy arranged for his 23-year-old daughter to have her brain cut. And here is the detail that turns your stomach. He did it without telling his wife. Rose Kennedy, Rosemary's own mother, said she was not told what was really being done until much later. The father made the decision alone, in secret, and handed his daughter to the 2 surgeons. That is not a medical decision anymore. That is a man deciding his daughter was his to erase, and that nobody else in the family even got a vote. And you already know what was waiting for her in that room. The drill, the butter knife, and 2 doctors who would keep cutting for as long as she could still pray. What that operation actually did to her is the part her family would spend the next several decades making sure you never heard. The operation didn't calm her, it erased her. Rosemary came out of that surgery unable to walk, unable to speak in a way anyone could understand. She was incontinent and her personality was simply gone, replaced by something with the mind of a small child. Over years of patient care, she would relearn a slow, limping walk, but she never spoke clearly again, and she never came back as the woman she had been. The bright young woman who curtsied before a queen and wrote in her diary about dress fittings was not there anymore, and so the family did the thing that would define the rest of her life. They hid her. Almost immediately she was sent away, first to a place in New York and then to a Catholic institution in Jefferson, Wisconsin, more than 1,000 miles from home, where she would live for around 55 years. Her father built her a private cottage on the grounds and nuns cared for her there. Here is how complete the disappearance was. For roughly 20 years, her own brothers and sisters did not know where she was. A future president had a sister he could not locate. The family put out cover stories that she was reclusive or quietly teaching children somewhere far away. Her mother reportedly did not visit her for about 20 years. Her father, the man who ordered all of it, reportedly never visited her again for the rest of his life. They didn't just break her, they filed her away and pretended she had never happened. You want this to be the story of one cruel father, one bad decision in one dark year. That's the comfortable version. But look at how long the silence held. Joe Kennedy had a stroke in 1961, and only then did the siblings finally learn where their sister had been kept. In 1962, her sister Eunice admitted publicly, for the first time, that Rosemary had a disability. But the lobotomy itself, the truth of what their father had done, stayed buried until 1987, when a historian finally put it in a book. More than 60 years of a life, most of it spent hidden from the world. History would come to call her the hidden Kennedy, and it fit. She had been a family secret for longer than most people are alive, and then something quiet turned. The sister they erased became the reason the family changed. Eunice, driven in part by what happened to Rosemary, went on to found the Special Olympics, a stage for exactly the kind of person her family had once hidden in shame, and her brother John, as president, signed a landmark law to fund care and research for people with intellectual disabilities. He signed it on the 31st of October, 1963. It was the last bill he ever signed. 3 weeks later, he was dead in Dallas. The sister they hid, the one they cut and shipped away and lied about, shaped the final act of the most famous Kennedy of all. Rosemary died in 2005 at 86 in Wisconsin. Her surviving sisters and her brother Teddy were at her bedside. She had spent a whole life being other people's secret, but she was a person first. She loved music and dancing and writing down her small ordinary days because they mattered to her. She was never a scandal and she was never a liability. She was a young woman who deserved a father who protected her instead of the family's name. That's the part worth remembering. Not the operation, her.